Yat bene. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. Today is July 4th, 2023. And I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee. And I want to have another discussion about this holiday that our nation continues to celebrate. And I especially want to talk about the Declaration of Independence and why that document refers to Native peoples as merciless Indian savages. But before I begin, I want to do as I always do, which is I want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Piscataway. They are now called Washington, D.C., but I want to honor the Piscataway as the host people, the original people of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state, especially on this day, how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. I see Mr. Phil Fox is on this morning. Yet, hey, Mr. Phil Fox, good to see you. Shelley, thank you for joining this morning. It's good to have you here. Thank you for being a part of this second cup of coffee. And yeah, so there's a lot of things that we can and need to discuss. Oh, Mary Myers, yet, hey, Abina, good morning, Mary. Thank you for joining this morning. So there's a lot of things that we need to talk about today regarding the 4th of July and regarding this holiday. But I want to start by you may wonder why, because I do so much writing, I haven't published anything new about the Declaration of Independence lately, and I haven't come out with any really kind of groundbreaking articles or anything. And part of the reason is because I don't know what else to say, right? It was back in 2006, actually, was the first time I started talking in depth about the doctrine of this, or the Declaration of Independence. And I actually found this graphic online, and it's a public domain graphic of the Declaration of Independence. And I created this graphic out of it, and I just highlighted the words merciless Indian savages. So you can see it's 30 lines below the statement where the Declaration refers to, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Only 30 lines later, right down here, 30 lines later, it refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. I've talked about this in my book. I've mentioned this in lectures. I've talked about this over and over and over again for the past almost 2 decades of my life. I've written articles. I put op-eds out about it. I've gone on podcasts and I've discussed it. And on one hand, I'm not sure what else to do, right? When I sit down and think, what else can I write? What else can I say? I don't know what else to do to really kind of press this conversation further. It was in 2015, back when I was living, it was my last year living on the Navajo Nation. And I wrote an article back then. It was titled, and let me just turn this off here. It was an article that I published on my blog, and I also published it at Native News Online. And that article was titled The Dilemma of the 4th of July. And since then, Native News Online has republished that article almost every 4th of July. They did actually publish it again this morning on their website. And I'm thrilled, right? I'm thrilled that these articles I've written, these op-eds I put out several years ago even, are continuing to get traction and continuing to kind of raise awareness and educate people to kind of create this common memory. And so I'm very grateful to Levi Rickert and people at Native News Online for republishing that article. I also put this up on my website. I'm going to share this with you. This is a link to many of the both op-eds, blog posts, and podcasts that I've done, second cups of coffee that I've done, discussing the Declaration of Independence, discussing the 4th of July, and urging our nation to temper its celebration, lament our history, and acknowledge we still deeply struggle with what our Declaration of Independence does, which is it literally dehumanizes Indigenous peoples by referring to us as merciless Indian savages. And so I welcome you to take a look at that. That is on my website, but I just put the link there into the chat here, so you can click on that link and you'll get a list of several blog articles I've written, published as op-eds, and then a few videos and other things I put out there regarding this. But today I thought, I didn't have necessarily anything new I wanted to say, but I definitely wanted to continue talking about this and to use today as another opportunity to educate our nation on what's written in our founding documents, and even go a little bit more into depth into why it's there. And so obviously, right, if you've heard me speak, if you've read my book, if you've paid attention to the stuff I talk about on my podcasts, all of this goes back to the doctrine of discovery, right? And the doctrine of discovery, written between 1452 and 1493, saying things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman, and their land is yours to take. So we see this very clearly articulated in the doctrine of discovery. And then we see that actually that mentality, that worldview gets spread throughout the founding of this nation, gets written into our founding documents, and gets used throughout our history as justification for continued oppression. And so one of the earliest references I could find to official documents from our colonizers referring to natives as less than human or outright as savages happened in the 1600s. So some of the history about this, in the 1616 to 1619, there was what was known as the Great Dying. It took place in the northeast part of Turtle Island, and literally entire villages, even large portions of native nations, were wiped out from disease that was spreading after it was introduced. These new diseases were introduced by the colonizers who came into these lands, and because native peoples had no immunity, no exposure to these diseases prior, it literally just wiped out entire villages, entire groups of people. This is in the Mayflower 400. It says the most alarming period is known as the Great Dying between 1616 and 1619. A mysterious disease ravaged the region where the Wampanoag lived as their lands were explored. Entire villages were lost, and only a fraction of the Wampanoag nation survived. In the winter of 1616 to 17, an expedition dispatched by Sir Fernando Jorges found a region devastated by war and disease. The remaining people so sore afflicted with the plague that the country was in a manner left void of inhabitants. And so this was the Great Dying that was going through the land at that time. Now, in 1620, King James, and this is the same King James who authorized the translation of the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible. In 1620, he gave the Charter of New England. And if you read the Charter of New England, this is in 1620, says, James, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, and to all whom these presents shall come, greetings. Whereas upon the humble petition of divers, our well-disposed subjects that intended to make several plantations in the parts of America between degrees of 34 and 45. Within these late years, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, together with many horrible slaughters and murderers committed amongst the savages and brutish people there, heretofore inhabiting in a manner to the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so that there is not left for many leagues together in a manner any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein, nor any other superior lord or sovereign to make claim hereunto, whereby we in our judgment are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come, in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us, and our people hath thought fit and determined that these large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such of our subjects and people, and heretofore have and hereafter shall by his mercy and favor and by his powerful army be directed and conducted thither. So after this period of great dying, when entire villages and populations of native peoples were wiped out due to these diseases brought by the people who were colonizing these lands, King James found that there were large areas of depopulation and wasn't even fully depopulated of people. He called us inhabitants. And in this second slide, he actually says, where did I get it here? Let me get this. Okay, second slide right here. Within these late years, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, together with the many slaughters and murders committed against the savages and brutish people there. So again, basically what King James was saying is God is fighting on our side and has allowed this incredibly wonderful plague to come upon the brutish and savage people inhabiting these lands. Now these lands are largely empty, and therefore they belong to us, and God has given us these lands, and therefore he is making this charter of New England. Right? So this is some of the earliest evidence I was able to find outside the Doctrine of Discovery, where the worldview, right? And this was not even Spain, where the Doctrine of Discovery originally came from, where you know the first explorers originally came from. This was Great Britain, right? They're now taking on this same worldview and basically saying, yeah, these savage peoples, God is fighting on our side to clear them out of these lands so that we can come in and claim it. Now, this is 1620, right? So 150 years, almost 140 years later, these lands have now been settled, and there are many colonies, both in what's now called the US as well as Canada. And in 1763, they create the Proclamation of 1763. So King George now makes this proclamation. Basically, he draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains, just to the west of where most of the colonies were. And he essentially says that the colonists no longer have the right of discovery of these empty Indian lands that are west of Appalachia. Now, the colonists came seeking these new lands. They wanted access to those lands. And so, especially the 13 colonies in what is now the United States of America, when they heard this proclamation that took away their right of discovery, it didn't take the right of discovery away completely. It said that right belonged to the crown. And so when the 13 colonies in what is now called the US heard this proclamation, they were very upset by it. And a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. And they went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. So now they are taking that same framing that was used 140 years later of these savage and brutish people, and now they're reframing that. So this was Great Britain referring to the native peoples of North America as savages, and now the colonists are borrowing that same legal language, and they are referring to us as merciless Indian savages, dehumanizing us. And of course, they signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Now, the problem is most Americans have never read the Declaration of Independence. They've never read it. And the Declaration of Independence, yes, it starts out with these great words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. At first, you have to note it says men, not men and women, or that all people are created equal. It doesn't say that. It says all men are created. So you have to note that it's blatantly a sexist document. Oh, Mr. Charles, but that's the old English. That's how they spoke back then. Men included everybody. Yeah, you know why they said men included everybody? Because women didn't count. They were blatantly sexist back then. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't own land. The old English was sexist. And then 30 lines later, their white supremacy rears its head. The merciless Indian savages. So the only reason the founding fathers use this inclusive term all men, right, which didn't include women, and now it doesn't include natives. So why do they say all men? Well, because their definition of who's human is actually incredibly narrow. The founding fathers of this country were absolutely blatant, unapologetic, both sexist and white supremacists. And it came out in their Declaration of Independence, right here, 30 lines below the statement. Refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear, right? This declaration is absolutely a systemically sexist and white supremacist document. That language of savage does not get included in the Constitution. We are excluded from the Constitution. Native peoples are. Black people are counted as 3/5. The Constitution never mentions women. There's 51 gender-specific male pronouns peppered throughout the entire Constitution. But it doesn't include the word savages, which is interesting because, right, this was such a core piece of the documents prior to that. But then in 1823, we had the Supreme Court case, which was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of the men got the piece of land, acquired the piece of land. I use acquired in quotes, please, from a native nation. The other claimed they acquired the same piece of land from the government. They want to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government. Case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the John Marshall Court. They have to determine the legal precedent for land titles. They state that it is discovery that gives title to the land. Discovery is what gives title to the land. And then, as they're building the argument, this is John Marshall. So it says the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. Then to reinforce his argument, because now you have to deal with the native nations, right? Because if discovery is what gives title to the land, certainly that would imply the people who were here first had already discovered it or had already had it, had possession of it. And so therefore the land would be theirs, right? So the Supreme Court has to take the argument deeper. You just can't say discovery. You actually have to invalidate the title that logically would exist within native nations. And so John Marshall continues to argue, and he says, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. So see now, because the Constitution doesn't define natives as savages, it excludes us, says we're not counted, but it doesn't define us as subhuman. Now the Supreme Court, which interprets the Constitution, needs to go back and say, okay, this is why Native peoples can't discover their own lands. They're savages. Basically, it's saying, you're right, they're occupants. Native nations are occupants of the land, like a fish occupies water or a bird occupies the air. And therefore, because we're not human, we don't have the land title. That belongs to the discovering European Christian white nations that were coming across the ocean. And so we see that getting embedded, that language of savage, that dehumanizing language that we first saw back in 1620 in the Charter of New England. We see it again in the Declaration of Independence, and now we see it for a third time very clearly, not in the Constitution, but in the people who are interpreting the Constitution, which is the Supreme Court in 1823. So we have the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s. Now, in the 1900s, right, so that precedent, so now savages, the fact that we are savages is now embedded into how this country does land titles. What's fascinating about the 1823 case is it doesn't go back to treaties, right? You would think for a nation, especially a nation that started with war, which is how this nation was founded, right? When you go into war, you end your war with a treaty. And in the treaty, you state who has the rights for the land. Now, the European nations were at war with each other, right? That's what the Revolutionary War was about. But it doesn't factor in the treaties made with native nations. And so even though the Constitution does state that treaties are the supreme law of the land, when land titles are in question, when the U.S.'s title to land comes into question, it does not refer to a treaty, because every treaty that the U.S. made with Native nations has been broken. Instead, it refers to a doctrine of discovery and the argument that natives can't have legal title to the land because they are not human. They are savages. Again, that language, the doctrine of discovery, this dehumanizing worldview, gets included in the Supreme Court opinions in 1954, 1985, and in 2005. Many of you have seen my TEDx talk titled "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History." If you haven't seen it, Google Mark Charles TEDx talk or Mark Charles "We the People." You'll find it. I talk about the same thing in that TEDx talk. And it's the 2005 case that I highlight. Because in 2005, again, our nation is there's a legal challenge regarding land titles, where the Onida Indian Nation, which had been removed from their lands in Central State New York back in the 1700s, they had come back in the 1900s and purchased some of their original lands, paying full price for them on the open market, and they wanted to reestablish their sovereignty over these lands. The lands they bought were within the city limits of the city of Sherrill. The city of Sherrill wanted the tax revenue, and so they sued the United Indian Nation, who were not paying their taxes, because they said we are sovereign over these lands. And so the city of Sherrill sued them and in federal district court, and the court ruled in favor of the Onida. So the city of Sherrill combined with the county and appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and that original decision was upheld. So they appealed a second time to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard the case. It was in 2004. The opinion came out in 2005. Again, you would think this would boil down to an issue of treaty, right? Because we're talking about who has possession of the lands. If the U.S. had legal possession of the lands, you think they would reference a treaty which gave them access to those lands. But in the first footnote of the case, they don't reference a treaty, they reference the doctrine of discovery. Right here, first footnote of the case. They go on to state, right, given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the land and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the New York State, and the United's long delay in seeking judicial relief. Now, mind you, the United's only had, I don't even know how long, not very long, maybe a few decades to actually take a case to the Supreme Court. And they reversed the decisions of the lower courts, and we ruled that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. Now they go on to reference another case, but they also include the argument in 2005 that says, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Onida sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Onida sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. Now, when I first read the 2005 opinion, that word wilderness caught my eye. Because A, that goes back to promised land theology of the Israelites spent time in the wilderness and committed genocide to take their promised land from the inhabitants of Canaan. And I thought I remembered also reading in the 1823 Supreme Court case. And so I went back and I looked up the argument in 1823, and sure enough, the 1823 builds the exact same argument. But the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Right? So when native peoples, savage people, less than human people live in the land, it is a wilderness and will never be anything else because savages cannot civilize a land. So you'll see the 2005 Supreme Court case is making the exact same argument that John Marshall made in 1823. They're just not using the word savage, but they're implicitly arguing the exact same thing by saying your land previously was wilderness means you were not human. You are not human. We cannot give it back to you. It would lose its civilized status. Right? It's building the exact same argument. So they reject the unification theory. This was 2005. Holds that standards of federal Indian law, again, the first footnote, doctrine of discovery, not the treaties, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. And of course, this, which is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime, was written and delivered by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I love showing that she was the author of that opinion. Why? Because she is the last person anybody would have ever expected would have written such an opinion and built such an argument. And it definitively proves that white supremacy is a bipartisan value. It is embedded deep, deep, deep into our foundations. It has become the legal precedent for land titles, and neither the left nor the right have any interest in changing that status quo. So why does the Declaration of Independence refer to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages? Because our founding fathers were blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacists. And they built an entire nation on that idea. And to this day, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have any interest in changing that. No interest whatsoever. I ran for president in 2020. I can tell you with absolute certainty, the majority of this nation have no interest in revisiting the founding principles for land titles, the legal precedent for land titles. They have no interest in that. And so we continue every year to celebrate a blatant, dehumanizing, unapologetic, sexist, and white supremacist document. And we say, this is our foundation for being the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that is why this nation has no clue what freedom or equality actually means. It is still viewing its understanding of freedom, of liberty, of equality through a white supremacist, racist, and sexist lens. And because it made those lenses the foundations, the legal precedent for land titles, it has no interest in changing them. And this is why I have not written an article in the last 5 years, 6 years, a major article about this. I've said what there is to say. I've laid it out. I've articulated it. And the nation doesn't want to hear it. I ran for president. And the nation doesn't want to hear it. I begged the media to publish stories about it. They don't want to hear it. Why? Because they can't sell it. The news media is about selling advertising, right? They don't want it. They can't sell advertising for this. Now, this doesn't mean I'm giving up. By no stretch of the imagination have I given up. But I'm taking a different direction, right? I don't quite know yet how to further engage the dialogue around the Declaration of Independence and around the doctrine of, or around the 4th of July. I'm a bit baffled to how to move that forward. But I am moving the conversation forward on Abraham Lincoln, right? In my book, On Selling Truths, the book I co-authored with my good friend Sing-Chan Ra. Yes, we have a chapter talking about the foundations of this country and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Supreme Court cases. We talk about all of that. But some of the most controversial, challenging chapters we have in this book are chapters 9 and 10, where we lay out the true legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We prove by quoting and demonstrating his policies and lining them up with historical facts, we prove that Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died. And we also prove that he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. Right now, it's hard to either challenge or even address the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July because it's become almost a very partisan holiday, right? Where the right has turn this into a love affair with the flag, and right, this extreme patriotism that it tends to taint itself and push itself much more to a right-leaning side. And so if I were to address or challenge our celebration of the Declaration of Independence and the 4th of July, I would be seen as someone from the left attacking the right. But both sides agree with the foundings and the ideas of the Declaration. They're just not aware of it. But it's easier to point that out when you address the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, because both sides love to claim Lincoln. The left and the right love to claim Lincoln, right? They love to hold him up as he is their flag bearer, right? The President Obama, first African-American president, black president in our nation's history, was sworn in with his hand on the Lincoln Bible, right? The Republicans can't stop reminding us that they are the party of Lincoln. Both sides love Lincoln. And even less people than understand about the Declaration of Independence understand who Abraham Lincoln really was. And so there's even a more tremendous shock. They know there's something there, right? They know enough about Lincoln to know they shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but they don't know what's there. And so when you lay it out, there's actually this moment where it's like it's almost easier to make a convincing argument about Lincoln because they already know there's something there they don't want to deal with, even though they love him. And so when you point it out, it actually makes it much harder for them to stay in a state of denial. Whereas it's easier, I found people are easier to stay in a state of denial about something like the 4th of July. So I'm working very hard right now. I'm developing some content, and I'm working very hard to engage our nation in a national dialogue about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and what it says about who we are as a nation, that we hold this white supremacist and genocidal man up as our greatest hero, our greatest leader ever. So I have not given up the struggle, but I'm not focused as much on the Declaration of Independence. There were probably 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 or 7 years, where I focused a lot of my energy on the Declaration of Independence, and I found that wasn't necessarily the best place to engage to point that energy. But now I'm trying instead to point that energy and to raise the dialogue. It's the same issues, but to raise it around Lincoln instead of around the Declaration. And I'm doing this 2023, throughout 2023 and 2024. Like, this is not like a short-term thing I'm going to try for a few months. This is something I'm devoting the next 18 to 24 months of my life to trying to do and see where we can get. So anyway, so these are some of the things I'm working on. But of course, everything that I'm doing, everything that I'm working on is about this, right? I am working hard to create common memory. I'm not trying to halt all celebration of the 4th of July. I personally, as a Native man, don't know how to celebrate it. This was never my war, right? The Revolutionary War was not my war. The document they're fighting for and celebrating refers to my Native peoples as savages, right? It's not my war. I do recognize it's a milestone in the founding of this country. So I'm not trying necessarily to halt all celebrations of the 4th of July, but I definitely want to temper them. I want people to reflect on how their nation, how our nation was founded, and the incredibly dehumanizing, racist, sexist, white supremacist ideas were held by our founding fathers and were written into our founding documents, and we've never fully addressed them. We've never fully fixed them. And so today we don't know what freedom, what equality, what liberty really looks like, because our only understanding of it is when we reserve those things for white landowning men. We don't understand how to apply equality across racial and gender and sexual orientation lines. We don't know how to do that as a nation. We've never done it. And so we have to temper our celebrations, right? This isn't a great milestone that we accomplished. This is a minor milestone in a journey we are absolutely still on, and I wouldn't even say we're halfway there yet. We have a long way to go. So let's temper our celebration. Let's acknowledge who we are and how we were founded as a nation. And let's try to bring some honesty, some honest reflection. Again, the goal is to form a better community, right? Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, common memory must be created. We need to create this common memory, my relatives. It may not drive our patriotism, but it will form a much healthier community. And that's what I would love to see. So I hope you have a great day. I hope I've given you a few things to think about. I hope you feel challenged in how you're going to celebrate today. And I hope that you are able to educate those around you as you also consider celebrating and yeah. I just hope I hope you will consider these things, and that you'll carry them with you. This is what it means to walk in beauty, my relatives. It means to be honest. It means to carry both the good and the bad. It means to have a deeper sense of humility. It means to give up our arrogance and to have a more humble understanding of our place in this world. Walking in beauty is not about celebrating your dominance or celebrating the fall of others. Walking in beauty is about holding your past and the tension of your past in a balance. So I hope you'll be able to do that better today, my relatives. I hope that this will be a good day for you. And I mean this sincerely when I say walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Asyahat and hakonet.